All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the invisible forces that really shape our behaviors and our mental health. Look, we all have things about ourselves we kind of want to change, right? Maybe it's a tendency to overwork, this unexplainable anxiety, or maybe you just shut down during a conflict. But what if I told you those feelings didn't actually start with you? We're going to explore the fascinating science and psychology behind generational trauma, and more importantly, exactly how we can break those cycles for good. Imagine carrying around this incredibly heavy, invisible backpack. It's totally full of survival tactics, fears, and stress responses. But here's the kicker. You didn't even pack it yourself. Literally long before your very first memory, your nervous system was already adapting to your environment. So consider this super powerful idea. The story didn't start with you, but it can change with you. You might have been born into the aftermath of some really painful family history, but guess what? You get to lead the repair. To make sure we have a clear, safe, and predictable roadmap for this explainer, here's our agenda. First, inheriting the invisible weight. Second, biology, behavior, and brains. Third, the impact on education. Fourth, building trauma-informed systems. And finally, steps to break the cycle. Let's get into it. Section 1. Inheriting the invisible weight. Decoding the pain passed down. The absolutely crucial point to grasp here is that those feelings of unexplained anxiety or hypervigilance, they might not actually be character flaws at all. They're inherited adaptations. What feels like your core identity is often just a survival strategy handed down from previous generations. Let's lay down a quick foundation. We've all heard the term PTSD, right? That's when you have persistent negative symptoms after being exposed to a specific traumatic event, things like intrusive memories or avoidance. But generational trauma is a whole different ballgame. This is when descendants of trauma survivors actually exhibit similar symptoms, like deep anxiety, low self-esteem, or trouble managing emotions, even if they never directly experienced the original trauma themselves. It gets passed down through both learned behaviors and, pretty remarkably, our actual biology. And hey, if you feel alone in this, just consider this staggering statistic. Nearly 70% of US adults have experienced at least one traumatic event. That means literally millions of people are walking around with nervous systems shaped by profound stress. And often, they're unknowingly passing these adaptations right on to their kids. Furthermore, 2/3 of US adults report at least one adverse childhood experience, or an ACE. We're talking about things like neglect, abuse, or household dysfunction. Now, here's where it gets really intense. Having multiple ACEs dramatically skyrockets your risk for chronic illnesses. The data shows us that folks with 4 or more ACEs face a 4 to 12 times higher risk for substance use and suicidal thoughts. Plus, way greater chances of developing heart disease or autoimmune disorders. The body literally holds onto the pain that the mind is trying to forget. So generational trauma isn't just one single thing. It actually shows up in 3 distinct ways: personal, collective, and historical. Personal trauma stems from family dynamics, like addiction or neglect, and that often shows up as having really poor boundaries or making caretaking your whole identity. Collective trauma comes from shared lived conditions like poverty or racism, which frequently results in constant vigilance and this intense pressure to overachieve. And then there's historical trauma. That stems from massive, large-scale events like colonization or war, creating deep institutional mistrust and limiting beliefs tied right to your identity. Moving on to Section 2, Biology, Behavior, and Brains, the Science of Survival. We're going to zoom into the hard science right now to remove any lingering shame you might be holding on to about your emotional responses. Because, listen, this is about biology, absolutely not weakness. You might be wondering, can trauma really be passed down through DNA? Well, the answer lies in a field called epigenetics. Trauma doesn't mutate your underlying DNA sequence, but it actually alters how certain genes function. For example, research on the children of Holocaust survivors shows real epigenetic changes in the FKB5 gene. That's the one that regulates cortisol, our stress hormone. This literally means your nervous system can be biologically wired to expect a threat before you're even born. It's kind of like inheriting a smoke detector that is already going off. You're essentially inheriting a heightened sensitivity to stress. Now, think about the rigid survival strategies so many families rely on versus the norms actually required to build healthy, lasting connections. So many cultures completely glorify stoicism, emotional suppression, and just relentless productivity. And sure, while those strategies definitely helped your ancestors survive, they come at a really quiet, heavy cost. Needs go unspoken, and vulnerability is viewed as a weakness. To truly heal, we have to consciously replace those survival strategies with new healing norms. I'm talking about embracing authenticity, enforcing healthy boundaries, establishing internal safety, and really allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. If you want to know why you can't just think positive your way out of trauma, just look at how it literally rewires the fear centers of your brain. Your amygdala becomes hyperactive, meaning it's constantly screaming danger. The anterior cingulate cortex persistently recalls intense fear memories. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex, which handles all that logical executive functioning, shows a decreased ability to divert your attention away from threats. And finally, the hippocampus becomes impaired, leaving you with this overgeneralized fear response. Your brain is structurally adapting to keep you safe in what it thinks is a super dangerous world, even when the actual danger passed years ago. Okay, Section 3, the impact on education, trauma in the system. Let's see how this biological micro level builds into a macro level impact on society, specifically focusing on the education system to see how undiagnosed trauma plays out in real time. When we look at studies on intergenerational trauma, specifically among Aboriginal students, they reveal massive systemic hurdles. Because previous generations experienced severe educational traumas, like the residential school system, families today might just lack the experience to help students navigate higher academic pathways. And the students themselves? They're often battling intense self-doubt, lacking coping strategies, and understandably holding a deep, deep mistrust of the school system or non-Aboriginal staff. The real tragedy here is that schools frequently mistake these trauma symptoms for just bad behavior, leading to harsh discipline rather than the empathetic support these kids desperately need. I want you to consider this incredibly powerful perspective. Allowing a student with a hidden disability to struggle academically or socially when all they need for success are appropriate accommodations, well, it's really no different than failing to provide a ramp for a person in a wheelchair. Because so many traumatized youth remain completely undiagnosed, they desperately need systemic scaffolding to succeed. Without it, the system is honestly just re-traumatizing them all over again. And that leads us perfectly into Section 4, Building Trauma-Informed Systems, a Systemic Solution. The good news here? There is a highly effective, systemic solution that completely reframes how we help individuals in pain. By adopting what's called a trauma-informed care framework, educators and organizations can shift the fundamental question they ask people. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with you?" trauma-informed care asks, "What happened to you?" It's a total game changer. This framework acknowledges that trauma is incredibly widespread. It trains staff to recognize the symptoms, actively avoids re-traumatization, and deliberately focuses on a person's inherent strengths instead of their deficits. Implementing this care is rooted in 5 distinct themes. First up, trauma awareness. That means recognizing that bad behavior is usually just a coping strategy. Next is accessible service, actively removing stigmas and financial barriers. Then, ensuring actual safety by making the environment physically and psychologically predictable. This naturally leads to being fully client-focused, which means giving the individual a genuine voice, choice, and autonomy in their own recovery. And finally, collaboration. This is all about dynamically sharing power and building strong peer support networks. And you know what? When we actually implement this framework, the outcomes are literally transformative. The data shows that this trauma-informed shift dramatically lowers psychological stress and aggression, it skyrockets student and client engagement, removes barriers, and it even lowers staff turnover. Why? Because the service providers themselves feel way more supported and experience much less burnout. It totally transforms a high-stress environment into a true sanctuary of safety. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Steps to Break the Cycle, Reclaiming Your Story. Let's zoom back into your individual agency here, because while you definitely didn't choose the pain that was handed down to you, you absolutely hold the power to end its grip. Thankfully, modern therapy offers an incredible array of clinical tools designed specifically for processing the kind of deep trauma that traditional talking alone just can't reach. Things like somatic therapy, which uses breath and movement to release physical stress literally stored in your body, or interventions like EMDR, which help the brain reprocess distressing memories so they finally lose that overwhelming emotional intensity. Then there's approaches like internal family systems, which help you listen to the wounded and protective parts of yourself with deep compassion. And of course, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is just fantastic for correcting those distorted thought loops that trauma tends to create. So, if you want a concrete, empowering roadmap to begin reclaiming your life right now, focus on these 5 essential steps. Step 1, identify the inherited patterns. I mean, you can't break a cycle you don't even see, right? Step 2, build secure, trusting relationships. Know that safety starts with trust, not performance. Step 3, Reparent your inner child by providing the comfort and boundaries your caregivers maybe couldn't. Step 4, consciously create and repeat new behavioral choices every single day. And step 5, reconnect with your cultural identity and ancestry. That's how you heal those deeper historical wounds and really find strength in your roots. The ultimate payoff of doing all this incredibly difficult work is what psychologists actually call post-traumatic growth. It isn't just about bouncing back to some baseline, it is a profound transformation. True healing reshapes your identity right at the root. By doing this work, you are giving an invaluable gift to the future. You permanently alter the emotional blueprint for the next generation. You ensure they inherit your healing rather than your pain. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly vital question. You didn't write the beginning of your story, but how are you going to write the end? Your legacy doesn't begin with what you inherited, it begins with what you change. You have the absolute power to be the one who turns generational pain into profound strength. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it empowers you to start writing a completely new chapter.